Honourable Chairman, Mr. Whiten, Sir John Daniel, has given me such a gracious introduction. Vice Chancellor of the Indira Gandhi National Open University, Professor Rajashekharan Pillai, Professor Ramanujam, who preceded Sir John with that highly generous and original welcome to me today. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, it is a privilege to deliver this lecture in honour of one of the great historians of our times, Baron Asa Briggs, former Chancellor of Britain's Open University. Like me, but at a far more distinguished level, Lord Briggs has, over the years, combined an interest in history with a fondness for literature and a deep involvement with the media. The idea that the media is a vital agent and a catalyst for social change has never been better expounded than by Asa Briggs. And my only regret is that that was not the subject that the organisers of today's events wished me to address here. Instead, I will attempt, as requested, to do justice to the broader themes of your conference this week, focusing on the challenges of education and literacy, social justice, community development, skills development, and formal education somewhat in relation to open learning. I'm far from an expert in any of these themes, but I do hope to offer you an outsider's perspective on them. Of the many paradoxes with which India abounds, the saddest must be that we are a country where nearly half the population is illiterate, but which has produced the world's second largest pool of trained scientists and engineers. A country which invents more sophisticated software for American computer manufacturers than any other country in the world, and yet in which there are at least 35 million children who have not seen the inside of a school. For those who care about illiteracy, India is the largest country in a subcontinent that gives great cause for concern. South Asia has emerged as the poorest, the most illiterate, the most malnourished, and the least gender-sensitive region in the world, with over half the world's illiterate adults and 40% of the world's out-of-school children. South Asia has by now the lowest adult literacy rate, roughly 49% in the world. It has fallen behind sub-Saharan Africa at 57%, even though in 1970 South Asia was ahead. 37% of all Indian primary school children drop out before reaching the 5th grade. We have a shortage of schools and a shortage of teachers, and the problem gets worse every year because of population growth. Our subcontinent has the worst teacher-pupil ratio in the world. The illiterate population of India alone exceeds the total combined population of the North American continent and Japan. The work of basic education has never been more needed. India has made only uneven progress in educating its population. Whereas most districts in this lovely state of Kerala, where you're all present today, following the introduction of free and compulsory education in 1957, have attained 100% literacy, the national literacy level still hovers around the halfway mark. The current figure is officially 62%, but I'll come back to that in just a second. Kerala has a literacy rate of nearly 100%, while Bihar is only at 44%, and Bihar has a female literacy rate of only 29%. The traditional explanation for the failure to attain mass education is two-pronged: the lack of resources to cope with the dramatic growth in population. We would need to build a new school every day for the next 10 years just to educate the children already born, and the tendency of families to take their children out of school early to serve as breadwinners, or at least to help at home or on the farm. Thus, though universal primary education is available in theory, and now is a matter of legal right, fewer than half of India's children between the ages of 6 and 14 attend school at all. But official national policy has undoubtedly long been in favour of promoting basic education. As a child at school, I remember being exhorted to impart the alphabet to our domestic servants under the Gandhian Each One Teach One program. And many of us were brought up on Swami Vivekananda's writings about the importance of education for the poor as the key to their uplift. But it's true that 63 years after independence, progress has been inexcusably slow. Obviously, there were policy choices being made here. For our first 6 decades, India spent less than 4% of its GNP on education. Only this year have we finally raised the level to 6% to put money behind the new education reforms, in particular the Right to Education Bill. Successive governments before this have collectively spent only 1/10 of the amount in education that they have committed to defence. What is missing is not just financial resources, but a commitment on the part of our society as a whole to tackle the educational tasks that lie ahead. Indian politicians are all too quick to take refuge in sharp rejoinders about not drawing the wrong conclusions from the illiteracy figures. Education, some argue even today, is not always relevant to the real lives of villagers or village Indians. For India's illiterates are still smart, and illiteracy is not a reflection of their intelligence or shrewdness, which they demonstrate, of course, by voting for the very politicians who make such arguments. Fair enough, but Kerala's literate villagers are smart too. Now that commitment is at last coming. There is a sea change in official attitudes to education, exemplified in the series of educational reforms being piloted through the current parliament. These days there is even ambitious talk of turning India into a knowledge society. The transformation of India into a knowledge society will depend on our capacity to provide and sustain knowledgeable citizens and workers. Currently, the need for education at all levels, including continuing education, which is essential for upgrading skills and for equipping our people to face the challenges of the workplace, are largely unmet. For example, fewer than 20% of Indians reach high school. Less than 10% graduate. In the case of higher education, only about 50 million out of our population of 1.1 billion people have degrees beyond high school. Ironically, India has one of the largest higher education systems in the world, with over 350 universities and 16,000 colleges, which produce more than 2.5 million graduates on an average every year. The problem is that, according to many corporate leaders, a majority of these graduates are unemployable without extensive retraining, and outside a few ivory towers of excellence, the system is failing to provide the know-how that our society needs in its citizens and workers. Now there has been good news. The adult literacy rate has more than tripled since 1951, from 18% in 1951 to 62 or 66, depending on whom you listen to, today. But, as I said I would come back to it, one must be wary of these figures. UNESCO, as Sir John Daniel certainly knows, defines an illiterate person as one who cannot, with understanding, both read and write a short, simple statement on their everyday life. By that definition, I suspect that fewer than half our population would really qualify as literate. The increase is even more dramatic for female literacy, from 9% at the time of independence to 43% in 2001. The gender gaps have been closing as female literacy increased much faster than male literacy, and I expect to see even better numbers in the 2011 census. The task of providing elementary education to all children is massive. India is making a major effort now to expand primary education. Our primary school system has become one of the largest in the world, with 150 million children enrolled, and on a typical day, roughly 290 million students are attending classes somewhere in India. But it's not enough. We hear more and more from progressive economists about the importance of what they call human capital. Human capital is defined as the stock of useful, valuable, and relevant knowledge built up in the process of education and training. Literacy is the key to building human capital. Education becomes indispensable, and human capital is the vital ingredient in building a nation. There is no industrial society anywhere in the world today with an adult literacy rate of less than 80%. No illiterate society has ever become an industrial tiger of any stripe, let alone a superpower. The key strategy, or at least a key strategy for creating sufficient and appropriate human capital, is to focus on basic education for all, starting with the young child. As Gabriela Mistral, the Nobel Prize-winning poet, so poignantly said, "We are guilty of many crimes, but our worst sin is abandoning the child, neglecting the foundation of life. Many of the things we need can wait. The child cannot. We cannot answer tomorrow. Her name is today." What is striking from the international experience is that whenever and wherever basic education was spread, the social and economic benefits have been quite striking and visible. The development strategies followed in recent decades by Japan, the East Asian industrializing tigers, and China laid a firm basis for equitable growth by massive investments in basic education for all. Literacy was fundamental not only to accelerating the economic growth of these countries, but to distributing resources more equitably and thereby to empowering more people. It's a truism today that economic success everywhere is based on educational success. And literacy is the basic building block of education. It's not just an end in itself. Literacy leads to many social benefits, including improvements in standards of hygiene, reduction in infant and child mortality rates, decline in population growth rates, increase in labor productivity, rise in civic consciousness, greater political empowerment and democratization, and even an improved sense of national unity as people become more aware than before of the country to which they belong and the opportunities beyond their immediate horizons. Education is also a basic component of social cohesion and national identity. The foundation for a conscious and active citizenship is often laid at school. Literacy and education play key roles in the building of democracy. In this state, my home state of Kerala, provides a striking example of how higher levels of literacy lead to a more aware and informed public. Because of the extraordinarily high levels of adult literacy here, as I said, nearly 100% compared to the official Indian figure of 66%, nearly half the adult population in Kerala reads a daily newspaper, compared to less than 20% elsewhere in India. 1 out of every 4 rural laborers reads a newspaper regularly, compared to less than 2% of agricultural workers in the rest of India. So literacy leads directly to an improvement in the depth and quality of public opinion, as well as to more active participation of the poor in the democratic process. This means that education plays an important role in the attainment of social justice. Educational institutions are expected to equip their students to the best of their capabilities to secure a meaningful place in society. Education is also the great leveler, fostering a process of developing an egalitarian society. But when a large number of people are excluded from the educational system, they cannot participate meaningfully in the economic, social, and cultural life of their communities. Educational reforms are thus required to address the needs of students, children really, who are particularly vulnerable to marginalization and exclusion. Access to education is a fundamental social need. But access to education, I'm conscious I've missed your discussions on the subject here, in my view has to move beyond merely securing admissions in various courses and programs leading to degree certificates and diplomas. The ultimate purpose of education must be the creation of awareness regarding livelihood, basic health, legal rights including human rights, and participation in all spheres of activity of a democratic society, placing emphasis on inclusive growth and development. The Indian Constitution, in its preamble, advances the idea of social justice and equality of status and opportunity to all. And Article 14 establishes that the state shall not deny to any person equality before the law or equal protection of the law. Article 15 prohibits any kind of discrimination on grounds of caste, creed, sex, birth, and so on. Nevertheless, access to several parameters of social justice is denied to many because of constraints emerging from discrimination, oppression, racism, classism, sexism, stereotyping, and prejudice against certain sections of society, a problem India shares with many developing countries. Access to education, or the lack thereof, is another significant constraint in the pursuit of social justice in our country. Amartya Sen, the polymath Nobel laureate in economics, has reminded us that, and I quote, "The elimination of ignorance, of illiteracy, and of needless inequalities and opportunities are objectives that are valued for their own sake. They expand our freedom to lead the lives we have reason to value," unquote. In his most famous poem, the other Nobel Prize-winning Bengali, the immortal poet Rabindranath Tagore, implicitly spoke of education as fundamental to his dream for India. And though the Indians in this room probably know this by heart, I will quote it for the non-Indians here. "Where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words reach out from the depth of truth, where timeless striving stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sands of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom, my father, let my country awake." That was Tagore. And it was therefore in a place where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, and where the mind is led forward into ever-widening thought and action, that Tagore hoped his India would awake to freedom. Such a mind is, of course, one that can only be developed and shaped by education. But more prosaically, illiteracy and inadequate literacy must be fought for practical reasons. How are we going to cope with the 21st century, the information age, if half our population cannot write a sentence about themselves or read a newspaper, let alone use a computer keyboard or surf the net? This is the information age. The world will be able to tell the rich from the poor not by their GNP figures, but by their internet connections. Illiteracy and poor levels of educational attainment are self-imposed handicaps in a race we have no choice but to run. India's significant progress in developing information and communications technologies, or ICT, can also be a major asset here. The use of ICT in expanding educational opportunities, particularly in supporting open learning, should not be underestimated. With improved broadband connectivity, ICT can allow a single teacher to reach a dozen classrooms in far-flung and remote areas of the country. ICT will also permit a focus on the role that open education resources play in enhancing the quality and reach of education. India is never going to be a great 21st century power if it doesn't educate its young. All of them, not just the ones who can afford an education. And what I say of India is true of every other developing country represented in this room today. Absorbing new technologies, raising productivity levels, improving the competitiveness and quality of exports, all hallmarks of development in the 21st century, all depend on the skills of a country's workforce. In the countries of East Asia, the so-called tiger economies, labor productivity has been rising approximately by 10% a year. And at least half of this can be attributed to investments made in education and technical skills. There is an increasing need in India for skilled manpower across all sectors of the economy. With India's increasing economic might, the big and growing gap between the demand for and supply of skilled people is widely felt. A study by the Observer Research Foundation concludes that by 2022, India will need to meet the target of skilling and upskilling 500 million people. The target cannot be met by the government of India alone or by conventional educational institutions alone. It has to be a combined effort by public and private institutions, embracing different government ministries, development partners, NGOs, private and faith-based providers, local community groups, educational institutions, and the corporate sector. It will need new vocational training institutions that are yet to be established, as well as recourse to two important assets of the Indira Gandhi National Open University, community colleges and distance learning. But we must start early, well before we get to the university stage, with India's young children. It is true that while the government recognizes the needs, it has neither the resources nor the ability to deliver quality education to all of India's children. Education is a state subject in our federal constitution, so its quality varies widely from Kerala's record in putting all children through school to Bihar's female illiteracy rate of 29%. Our state governments have not been able to enroll all children between the ages of 5 and 10 in school, nor are they able to retain the ones they enroll. Some drop out, as I mentioned earlier, because their families can't afford to keep them in school, when they could be out to work in the fields or weaving rugs or making footballs. Some because the teaching is so abysmal that they don't learn anything at school anyway. Ensuring that the students achieve decent learning outcomes and acquire values and skills that enable them to play a positive role in their societies is a remote prospect. One ignores at one's peril the role of education in nurturing the creative and emotional growth of learners and helping them to acquire values and attitudes for responsible citizenship. As I stated earlier, more Indian kids have never seen the inside of a school than those of any other country in the world. And those who have may not see a teacher, since we hold the world record for teacher absenteeism, or be given the books and learning materials without which the educational experience is incomplete. But since you were amused by that comment, let us spare a thought for the poor teacher. In India, teachers are too often underpaid, underappreciated, and therefore undermotivated. We have a nationwide shortage, no wonder, of 25 lakh, 2.5 million teachers. And several of those who do exist on the rolls, especially in our village schools, don't actually teach. They show up once a month to collect their government salary and are AWOL the rest of the time. Teachers are, or should be, the biggest influence on their impressionable charges, at least after their parents. Their impact on young lives is profound and long-lasting. They shape the character, the curiosity level, and the intellectual potential of their students. In other words, they help shape our society. So far, undervalued and in many cases underqualified, they are doing an uneven job. How on earth can we maintain our much vaunted economic growth rates if we don't produce enough educated Indians to claim the jobs that a 21st century economy offers? We rely on a handful of excellent private and missionary schools, a large number of uneven but mostly hopeless government schools, millions of kids with no schooling at all, and the efforts of a number, not large enough, of charitable organizations. This is why distance learning becomes so important, because it's an important tool for ensuring access to quality education. The Somali Distance Education for Literacy program, for example, that I read about, teaches literacy, numeracy, and life skills through weekly radio programs, print materials, and face-to-face instruction. In a country without a functioning government and an ongoing civil war, they have over 10,000 registered learners, with at least 70% of them women and girls in about 350 classes. Similarly, the Open School Society in India reaches out to over 100,000 learners, many of whom are dropouts, children from the underprivileged castes, and learners with disabilities. The program also has the advantage of being able to provide equivalence with the formal educational system while remaining culturally and linguistically relevant to local needs. And for people with disabilities, especially those in remote rural areas, there is no substitute for distance learning. India's National Sample Survey shows that the non-availability of schooling facilities in India accounts for about 10% of the never enrolled in our rural areas and about 8% in urban India. The difference between the sexes is larger in the urban areas. A large number of people, both in rural and in urban India, particularly women, cannot avail of the educational services because of their participation in household economic activities and other socio-economic reasons. In all such cases, the importance of distance learning cannot be overstated. Education also plays a vital part in community development, broadly defined as a set of values and practices which permits a community to overcome poverty and disadvantage, knitting the society together at the grassroots and deepening democracy. Education is one of the most essential aspects of a developed community. Throughout time, universities have played an important social role through the creation, preservation, and extension of knowledge to and within communities. Universities cannot afford to remain as oases of excellence when the communities sustaining them are silently turning into deserts. The linkage between universities and communities is vital. there is a need for universities to reach out to communities and to make their policies and structures more flexible and relevant to community development. Community-based learning enriches coursework by encouraging students to apply the knowledge and analytical tools gained in the classroom to the pressing issues that affect the daily lives of people in the communities around them. A useful example of the advantages of community-based learning is soil fertility management in Western Kenya. Farmers and researchers used community-based learning approaches and jointly developed an approach built on farmers' folk ecology and outsiders' knowledge, while going beyond methods that were merely curriculum-driven. Similarly, the Learning for Farming program in several Commonwealth countries has been advantageous in linking farmers to the information that can help them improve their livelihoods. Might add that community radio can be another beneficial tool for community-based learning. It can play an essential role in giving young people the skills that can lead to better livelihoods and help them seek employment or self-employment. It can also raise awareness on health, which is also a developmental challenge in several developing countries represented here today. Community radio can provide non-formal educational opportunities, especially for communities that are not fully literate. Radio dramas, storytelling, interviews in particular, are effective and low-cost ways of making community voices an integral part of the learning process. In addressing the challenge of learning for development, open and distance learning can play a particularly important role, building a bridge between knowledge acquisition and skills development, and the potential to reduce the inequalities of access that blight conventional education in most countries. But since I've mentioned gender difference, I think before I conclude, I think it's essential to focus on that specific aspect of the educational challenge across the world and specifically in my country today. In my view, the other sad aspect of India's literacy statistics is the disproportionate percentage of women who remain illiterate. 60% of India's illiterates are women. And female literacy at 43%, this is of course the census of 10 years ago, but still was 26 percentage points below male literacy at 69% in that figure. No society has ever liberated itself economically, politically, or socially without a sound base of educated women. I don't know whether Sir John had the same experience, but one of the most difficult questions I used to find myself being asked when I was a UN official, especially when I was addressing a generalist audience, is what is the single most important thing that can be done to improve the world? It's a kind of question that brings out the bureaucrat and the most direct of communicators, as one feels obliged to explain how complex are the challenges confronting humanity, how no one task alone can be singled out over other goals, how the struggle for peace, the fight against poverty, the battle to eradicate disease must all be weighed side by side, and so mind-numbingly on. But of late, I decided to cast my caution to the winds and ventured an answer to this most impossible of questions. If I had to pick one thing we must do above all else, I tell people, I now offer a 2-word mantra: educate girls. It really is that simple. It really is that simple. There is no action proven to do more for the human race than the education of the female child. Scholarly studies and research projects have established what common sense might already have told us, that if you educate a boy, that's a good thing, you educate a person. That if you educate a girl, you educate a family and benefit an entire community. The evidence is striking. Increased schooling of mothers has a measurable impact on the health of their children, on the future schooling of the child, and on the child's adult productivity. The children of educated mothers consistently outperform children with educated fathers and illiterate mothers. Given that they spend most of their time with their mothers, this is hardly surprising. A girl who has had more than 6 years of education is better equipped to seek and use medical and healthcare advice, to immunize her children, to be aware of sanitary practices from boiling water to the importance of washing hands. A World Bank project in Africa established that the children of women with just 5 years of school had a 40% better survival rate than the children of women who had less than 5 years in class. A Yale University study showed that the heights and weights for newborn children of women with a basic education were consistently higher than those of babies born to uneducated women. A UNESCO study demonstrated that giving women just a primary school education decreases child mortality by 5 to 10%. The health advantages of education extend beyond childbirth. The dreaded disease AIDS spreads twice as fast, as a Zambian study established, amongst uneducated girls than amongst those who have been to school. Educated girls marry later and are less susceptible to abuse by older men. And educated women tend to have fewer children, space them more wisely, and so look after them better. Women with 7 years education, according to one study, had 2 or 3 fewer children than women with no schooling. The World Bank, with the mathematical precision for which they're so famous, has estimated that for every 4 years of education, fertility is reduced by about 1 birth per mother. Now, the more girls go to secondary school, the bank adds, the higher the country's per capita income growth. And when girls work in the fields, as so many have to do across the developing world, their schooling translates directly to increased agricultural productivity. The marvelous thing about women is that they like to learn from other women. So the success of educated women is usually quickly emulated by their uneducated sisters. And women spend increased income on their families, which men do not necessarily do. Rural toddy shops in India thrive on the self-indulgent spending habits of men, after all. In many studies, the education of girls has been shown to lead to more productive farming and in turn to a decline in malnutrition. Educate a girl and you benefit a community, QED. As my former UN colleague Catherine Bertini once put it, and I quote her, "If someone told you that with just 12 years of investment of about $1 billion a year for the whole world, you could, across the developing world, increase economic growth, decrease infant mortality, increase agricultural yields, improve maternal health, improve children's health and nutrition, increase the numbers of children, girls and boys, in school, slow down population growth, increase the number of men and women who can read and write, decrease the spread of AIDS, add new people to the workforce, and be able to improve their wages without pushing others out of the workforce, what would you say? Such a deal, what is it? How can I sign up?" Unquote. Sadly, the world is not yet rushing to sign up to the challenge of educating girls. That was the message. You can achieve all of this by just educating every girl child. And yet they lag consistently behind boys in access to education throughout the developing world. Same with India, with the honorable exception of Kerala. We have a long way to go. In Bihar, we used to boast an illiterate chief minister, a female chief minister in the state of Bihar, as if to showcase its abysmal figure of 29% female illiteracy rate, one of the worst on the planet. But anyway, there is good news. Her 7 daughters did indeed receive an education. So perhaps after all there are grounds for hope. Certainly there is no better answer. My former boss, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, put it very simply. I'll quote again: "No other policy is as likely to raise economic productivity, lower infant and maternal mortality, improve nutrition, promote health, including the prevention of HIV/AIDS, and increase the chances of education for the next generation." And he added, "Let us invest in women and girls." Unquote. Let us indeed do that. And let us educate boys too. We need to achieve 100% literacy across the world. We need to educate our people in every developing country. We need to use all the techniques that I've tried to describe and summarize for you in this lecture if we are to fulfill the aspirations that we have all begun to dare to articulate and rise to the development challenges of the 21st century. Thank you, and Jai Hind.